our next presentation will be by Sturt from Cornell University. And the title of his paper is Resolving Timescale and Multi-Year Human-Scale Climate Impacts in the Eastern Mediterranean. Take it over, Sturt.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me and see the presentation. So hello
Yes.
from Ithaca, New York, and thank you very much to Tim and to the ICAANE organizers for making this all possible. This paper wishes to consider the different timescales relevant to differing types of historical investigation, and in trying to investigate the linkages between these and climate. So in a sense, climate and history, climate and archaeology. And in particular, to end up considering whether we can now, routinely, so to speak, start to look to analyze archaeological sites, primarily with no texts, at the sort of scale and with the types of focus that might enable us to get beyond the basic underlying structure, the longue durée, thousands of years, geological time, geography, culture, etc., and, for example, long-term and general climatic changes of the sort we tend to see in pollen diagrams and so on, and towards both conjoncture or the moyenne durée, time in decades or even to a century or so, and so economic, social, political time, and even practical examples of substantive rapid climate change at the decadal to the centennial level, just as other historians have identified episodes like the Industrial Revolution, for example, in much more recent periods, and also then to the time of the event, or the court durée, as Brodel talked about, the duration of days, weeks, maybe a year, the time specifically of personal politics and relations, diplomacy, and high-frequency weather, as opposed to climate, events like storms, floods, droughts, and so on. The longue durée is familiar to archaeologists, and much of the traditional archaeological framework and narrative is effectively written and conceived in longue durée terms. Diagrams like the one on the right litter the archaeological literature. No people, no history, but blocks of apparent time by the half-century, centuries, or even millennia in some cases. Typical of the frustration of those trying to approach an historical type of analysis is John Cherry in 2010, commenting on the early Bronze Age of Crete as an example, that, quote, when we refer, often somewhat cavalierly, to the pre-palatial period, we should remember that this now refers to a vast span of some 1,200 years, far too long to constitute an era about which anything meaningful in way of generalization is possible. The recent enthusiasm for some probability distribution-based analyses from databases of radiocarbon at best offer poorly resolved versions of the longue durée. They get nowhere near past people and history, though the patterning often does rather reflect modern research history rather better. Thus, while some broad demographic evidence may be captured in these analyses, and I don't dispute the work and effort involved, there are a number of fundamental problems. Some have been recently described in Grukat's 2021 paper, others have been described and efforts to address by Michael Price et al. In a paper that's going to be at the SAAs in another week and a bit's time, and elsewhere. But at the core, the trouble is that these wiggles are not informative of agency and people's lives, just some dread dehumanized trend extracted by dubious statistical methods after throwing everything into the food processor. A human history instead falls in and between the registers of the moyenne durée and the time of events. Traditionally, this is where material culture-based archaeology, in particular, has started to struggle a little, and we start citing information from historical texts, inscriptions, and so on. The advent of AMS 14C dating, the application of Bayesian chronological modeling, and also dendrochronology has radically changed the situation the world over. It offers an escape from indirect archaeological time, guesstimated and rather approximately through stepwise logic transfers from some supposed historical reference via various intermedia to give us a number or a block in a chart. And it instead permits direct, independent dating of the context of interest with increasingly the capacity to resolve time down into the order of a lifetime or a generation, so towards the shorter of the two Brodelian timescales, maybe even a generation, by incorporating prior knowledge into the analyses. An example from North America where until recently the timescale in the period from the 15th to the 17th centuries derived from trying to determine associations with European trade goods is illustrative. Part of the reason that there was a problem here in the past was a plateau in the radiocarbon calibration curve. This seemed to make resolution difficult between the 15th and the 17th centuries. Thus, you could have lots of radiocarbon dates, like on the slide on the right, but they all seem to give similar calendar age ranges across about 150 to 200 years. Bayesian chronological modeling incorporating the relationships determined between the three sites in this example dramatically changes this situation and yields a chronology refined to a few decades for each site, the sorts of period of time that ethnography tells us these villages were occupied for, and a human timescale of lifetimes and a generation. It offers a highly resolved chronology distinctly different, later in this case, than the previous conventionally assigned dates. We move from approximate and in fact incorrect blocks of time to the timescale of human history. Such Bayesian approaches are now widely applied in the ancient Near East. I show one example analyzing the data from Tel Twine in coastal Syria. Apart from chronological resolution, much improved over past analyses, another major gain is the ability to determine and to quantify queries, such as the period of time, for example, between dated events. Further, such greater quantification and resolution enables us to address historical hypotheses. For example, were the so-called Sea Peoples responsible for the approximately contemporary destructions at Tel Twine and Pila in Cyprus, as proposed in the 2011 article that brought this site to attention? The answer, in fact, seems to be that it's just about possible, but in both cases, on the right, if you compare the bar and the Sea Peoples versus the probability distributions, but in both cases, the range of possible Sea Peoples dates from interpretations of the Ramses inscriptions and all possible Egyptian chronologies of any scholarly standing are outside the most likely 68.3% ranges for both of the sites, their destructions, suggesting in fact that the Ramses Sea Peoples may not necessarily have been associated. The ability to test historically derived hypotheses has other powerful relevance. It also provides the opportunity, independently of previous assumptions and beliefs, to test site chronologies and wider, proposed from attempted linkages with historical chronologies, e.g. from Egypt. Tel el-Dabar in the Nile Delta is a good example. The Bayesian analysis of a recent set of radiocarbon dates according to the site stratigraphic sequence offers a nice analysis consistent with the stratigraphy. But, as was clear from the publication in 2012 and since, consistently these dates and the analysis strikingly fails to conform to the supposed dates proposed by the excavator. So look on the right-hand side. The date should be falling where the dotted lines are, and the arrows are indicating how much they are wrong. So by more than a century in every case. Since some may think the problem is somehow with radiocarbon, let us also note you can ask the question the other way around. What should have happened if the excavator's dates were in fact correct? Well, if we model a dozen random hypothetical radiocarbon dates on short-lived samples from each stratum at Tel el-Dabar and run multiple iterations of such a model, thus trying effectively hundreds and then thousands of random combinations, we find results that look like those shown here for some of the strata. Strikingly, the dates have determined more or less the expected range were the excavated chronology correct, even reasonably in the worst of 20 cases run. Thus, had the excavator's dates been correct, the radiocarbon should have found a similar result, and we can indeed hope to resolve periods of a few decades or so in time as the expectation, as here in this hypothetical example. The time of events is the stuff of history, but sometimes a problem for archaeology. The archaeological record may not in fact represent all such events, and trying to force different facets of history together can be problematic in theory and in practice. Thus, the efforts to link a particular burnt destruction with a specific ruler or general's attack may always be questionable, and has been a fault in much A&E archaeology where destruction levels are attributed to somebody. However, some types of context can offer the ability to approach the event. Shipwrecks are such a case. The Ullenbrunn shipwreck, for example, combining tree ring sequence wiggle match dating on some of the ship timbers and dating of shorter and short-lived material from the ship's contents, necessarily after the ship timbers, places the date of the ship's last voyage quite specifically. So on the left-hand side, you can see the fit of the wood in the brown and the contents in green and against the calibration curve. We can estimate the terminus post quem from the ship launch, from the timbers, and then for the last voyage or the wrecking event from the contents, and even query the amount of time in between. Now, since in this case, the estimate for the time between the service period seems a little long compared to expectations, we can in fact also model this with a more plausible ethnohistoric constraint on what the service period could be. And we achieve slightly revised estimates as a result. Again, we approach the precision now to engage with history. The Ullenbrun's contents included a scarab of Nefertiti. The worn state of the scarab and the context and associations all suggest this must represent a post-Amarna period. We see that the modeled age ranges for the last voyage very nicely provide just this versus the standard dates for Nefertiti as queen from Kitchen or von Beckerath or Schneider or Aston. Whereas in contrast, if we were to plot the lower chronology of Krauss and Warbert in 2009, we would find rather less comfortable fit in which the dates more or less match the last voyage, which seems to be impossible given our understanding of how the scarabs would work, suggesting yet again that radiocarbon and a date and a secure historical chronology can give us dates and consistent results that work together. Now let us turn to climate history and how we might bring these together and what timescales are appropriate, and can the resolutions we have just reviewed be useful? Here, ironically, history is often the initial problem. Historians, or archaeologists writing history, like to be dramatic and like to have specific hooks to hang things on or from. Thus, there is a tendency for the specific and the dramatic. It sells books, of course, but does it explain? Usually, whenever one investigates in detail the relationship between climate and history, we tend to find that what creates a positive association is not the singular or the very short term. Sometimes it is the sustained, more favorable conditions, as argued for the earlier Roman period, as also relevant to the rise of the Assyrian Empire in the arguments made in the paper on the right from Sinner, or it's in terms of the negative. And there's also periods of at least a few years to a few decades that challenge and then undermine and then overwhelm the risk buffering social and economic adaptations of a society. So the detailed analysis of likely maize productivity, for example, in central Mexico, determined by correlations with tree ring late wood width in Douglas fir, gives a good example where periods or clusters of several very poor production years correlate with known historic famines and social crises. It's not the specific year, it's a specific cluster. In the Mediterranean and the Middle East region and elsewhere, historians and anthropologists find that ancient sources, traditional farmers, and archaeology all point to social and economic adaptations to cover an expectation of relatively regular bad years. High frequency, so that's annual, challenges are anticipated. They may explain events, but not history. In reverse, the very low frequency, longue durée, provides context and background, but does not explain or enable a particular historical narrative. It is the medium frequency conjunctures that afford substantive climate history associations, leading to change where circumstances conspire to overwhelm what is reasonably anticipated and possible to defend against. Second millennium CE Anatolia provides an example if we consider reconstructed precipitation from tree ring records from southwest Anatolia and the North Aegean. There is much high frequency variation, the red and black lines going up and down, but rarely, the triangles at the bottom of each graph, is precipitation below about the 68% range for 2 or more years in a row, and only very rarely, the stars, is rainfall below the 95% range of normal. And only very rarely do such very poor years cluster together. The period at the start of the 17th century and the time of the Jalali rebellions, when the great Ottoman Empire nearly fell, is one of the only such times in the pre-modern era that this occurred. Thus, the times that climate really drives history are relatively rare in this case. But the connection of history and climate, just 2 examples there, but the connection of history and climate and history critically depends on a precise and accurate chronology. This leads me to close with a brief review of a new area of interest and focus for those working on the chronology at high resolution of the East Mediterranean and Middle East region. So I illustrate here some preliminary work already from stable isotope, which we could start to calculate moisture availability and the critical need to have the time scale if we're going to tie this against either the archaeology or the history. The INTCAL radiocarbon record that we rely on for ages from radiocarbon primarily reflects the radiocarbon record for Central to Northern Europe and North America. In particular, European oak forms a key element for the last several thousand years. Typically, oaks start to form new wood, early wood, just prior to bud break, which happens around the end of April to the beginning of May. The transition to late wood occurs around the end of June, beginning of July, and radial growth is completed between late August and mid-September. Further north, high-latitude Northern Hemisphere conifers are even more summer-focused. In all cases, there is then later autumn through winter dormancy. The radiocarbon recorded in all these tree rings reflects this spring through summer period. For example, Levin and Kromer observed that the radiocarbon record measured from tree rings of a Norway spruce from 1974 to 1985, collected in the near vicinity of the Schausenland atmospheric sampling station in southern Germany on the left, yielded a radiocarbon record closely matching the late spring and summer, so May to August, atmospheric radiocarbon values at the same station. Now, trees and plants from high elevations, so areas with winter snow cover, or strongly continental climates, parts of Iran, etc., or the north of the East Mediterranean, Middle East, far north, are not very dissimilar. They have growing seasons and responses reasonably aligned with those in Central and Northern Europe, so no real difference. But in marked contrast, trees and plants growing elsewhere, and particularly in the lower and warmer areas of the East Mediterranean, where the majority of the human population live, and from more southerly contexts, typically have earlier growing seasons, from autumn, winter through late spring or early summer. Cereal crops growing in the more arid and lower elevation regions of the East Mediterranean Middle East, for example, in the Mesopotamian region, end their growth usually somewhere between April to May. These crops primarily grow from around late autumn, with flowering in the spring and harvest in the late spring to early summer, e.g. harvest mid-May for North Syria. Looking to both history from ancient Near Eastern sources, ancient history, Hesiod and subsequently, and ethnography, we can observe that the general dry farming pre-modern growing season for field crops in the lower to medium elevation Mediterranean is broadly October to May. In the Middle East, it is similar, and if anything, even slightly earlier in some areas, sowing in autumn and harvest in spring. This is the major field crop production period. It is even more offset from Central European oak in the case of pre-modern Egypt. Here, the growing season followed the July to October Nile flood. Nor is this just about field crops. The issue is relevant to some tree species, for example. For example, junipers in southern Jordan have growing seasons from autumn to early summer. In all cases, these East Mediterranean Middle East plants therefore reflect the atmospheric radiocarbon record for this growing period, winter to spring. There is only minor overlap with the growth period of European oaks, spring to summer. Does all this detail matter, and do you want to know? When radiocarbon dating was relatively approximate, no. But as precision increases, then the answer starts to move towards yes. Based on the carbon cycle observations from a set of stations around the world, and especially the work of Ingeborg Levin, there is a well-known latitudinal aspect to radiocarbon around the globe, and in addition, a well-known intra-annual cycle atmospheric radiocarbon levels, as shown on the screen. Here, theory and observation attest to an intra-annual cycle in transport across the extratropical tropopause, which creates a natural seasonal variation in mid-latitude tropospheric, i.e. ground level, radiocarbon levels. This process leads to an observed winter-spring low in radiocarbon levels and a summer to early autumn high. To estimate the pre-modern, natural, seasonal radiocarbon cycle, we may refer to the atmospheric data from the recent past. If we approximately exclude the modern fossil fuel contribution and atmospheric biosphere exchange, this leaves the underlying pre-modern seasonal maximum intra-annual variation for the mid-latitude northern hemisphere as of the order of up to maybe 4 per mil, so that's about 32 radiocarbon years, and likely in a typical range of around 2 to 3 per mil, so maybe about 16 to 24 radiocarbon years. So, when radiocarbon dating areas were typically greater than plus or minus 60, or even plus or minus 30 or more, the case until only a decade ago, this was just additional noise in the system, pretty much irrelevant. But now that measurement errors are starting to be around or better than plus or minus 20 for the past several thousand years, we start to have an issue worth attention. For the mid-latitudes, especially where, until this point, the assumption has been of similar levels all around the Northern Hemisphere, and hence one calibration curve is considered as okay. Instead, with the greater precision, and we hope obviously also accuracy, the evidence of different growing seasons can and should therefore reflect different parts of this annual radiocarbon cycle. And when sufficiently offset, there are likely to be small but potentially important differences. A small preliminary investigation looking at tree rings of Phoenician juniper in southern Jordan suggested this topic could be of relevance to archaeological dating at high resolution. Nor was this the first indication. Previously, the correct dating of series of historically associated or known age Egyptian radiocarbon samples, both fairly recent and ancient, was shown to require allowance again for a small regional or growing season adjustment. These findings did not engender the serious attention one might have expected. The apparent differences or offsets were small, thus most seem to ignore to treat as a detail, but they do seem to be real. The very recent study of Brem et al. 2021, while finding that the new data reduced a little the offsets observed in the 2018 Jordan study versus the previous INTCAL 13 curve, nonetheless found that some offset remains evident. Again, in a study published last year looking at tree ring chronology from Anatolia, a similar offset was evident between radiocarbon in these tree rings versus those in the INTCAL 20 curve. With increased precision, these small differences are in fact potentially important at high resolution. Since there may well be a degree of skepticism concerning this statement, perhaps we need to consider what's the relevance in terms of climate. The potential impact of a small growing season radiocarbon offset applies generally, but is especially effective at times when the radiocarbon calibration curve shows a reversal or plateau. The beginnings and ends of these periods in particular see maximum differences in the case of an offset, as for example the slide showing here, period from AD 1000 to 1500. We can examine the differences that apply depending on whether or not a small growing season offset is allowed for. So if we look at the graph here, I've allowed for a 12 plus or minus 5 radiocarbon years offset, as has been suggested, paper we wrote last year, as possibly relevant for AMS, modern AMS data versus the modern AMS-based curve. So it's a minimum value for the best data. The slide shows some of the differences. The results show the difference between a simple calibration with INTCAL in the cyan or bluey. The other set of results in the pink magenta shows what happens if you apply the offset that we expect in the East Mediterranean Middle East region. And you can see that although they're similar, there are differences. And as evident at a number of intervals, the green arrows, especially around the beginnings and ends of reversals and plateaus in the calibration curve. These differences are therefore exaggerated at times of such change. They tend to be the same time that changes happen in the archaeological and historical record. Is there a connection? Well, yes. The relationship between the calendar and 14C timescales is not only non-monotonic, but it's driven by particularly solar irradiance changes and linked to ocean atmospheric processes during the Holocene. Thus, it is effectively a proxy for types of climate change. That it is likely there is a direct association with climate history. The result is these very periods in which we tend to have offsets are going to be the ones of interest to historians and archaeologists for climate change. The hypothesis of a link with climate change makes the topic of radiocarbon offsets even more important and, interestingly, may reopen some questions when it comes to the high-resolution dating of archaeological contexts versus other independently dated proxies. Inherently, it appears that such radiocarbon offsets will be both historical change periods and focal dating targets for archaeology and history. If we are to properly understand such periods, a focus of much recent research, we need both the secure, precise chronology and to understand the climate context. 3 last examples illustrate the relevance of the topic. 1, the period around the 4.2 climate change episode linked with the end of the Akkadian Empire. 2, the 3.2 Ka climate change period around the end of the Late Bronze Age. And 3, the 5th to 6th century AD period linked with major climate and so-called political changes linked with the Late Antique Ice Age. In each case, you spot they are on one of these conspicuous plateaus in the radiocarbon calibration curve, which would maximize the effect of a radiocarbon offset in the East Mediterranean Middle East region. A number of other historical change points, as recently as the Little Ice Age, apply as well. I point to some with the arrows. I'd close by suggesting that we will need to pay more attention to growing seasons and regional radiocarbon records in the future. This is going to depend, the success will depend on how much we can tie together archaeology and climate in detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sturt. And we've got a couple minutes here before we're going to break. And I thought maybe I'd start with a question, just a sort of a general one from the kind of crane perspective of a similar question I was asking with some of the previous presenters about the connection between some of the data that you're working with some of the archaeological sequences. I know from our own experience with the Tainat sequence that we've been working on with you, and I know you've also been working with Zingerle, but I'm wondering on a kind of a larger regional basis, whether you might have any comments about how we might weave multiple sites together, sort of maybe a next step in this process of trying to improve the timescales, but also connecting that to the whole, I mean, rather than just one site specific, but into a larger like matrix of sites and sequences and so on. If you have any thoughts or comments about what might be the smartest next step to help us get there.
Well, that nicely demonstrates some of the challenges and complications, because you can work out, for example, for a particular site or local area, what might be the relevant offset, but that is not going to be consistent across a vast region. So that's from one perspective. The other way of looking at it, of course, is at the present moment, we have a few well-dated sites from radiocarbon, and then we have some that are supposedly well-dated from archaeology or history. But we need to actually stop having apples and oranges being compared. So what we really need are whole regions and sets of sites being compared together on the same consistent basis. So, for example, Zingerle and Tainat can be compared together on the same consistent basis, but that doesn't apply to then many other sites. So the need to move towards having a synchronization of large assembled radiocarbon chronologies and to consider the exact basis for each of those, just to pick the obvious, we cannot assume that the radiocarbon offset for somewhere in inland Syria heading into Iran, into high elevations, it will not be the same as in coastal Syria, for example. So one of the faults, I think, of the past, both for archaeology, where we assume that one ceramic type, for example, just appears everywhere, seemingly all at the same time, and we ignore regional differences and so on. Same with radiocarbon. The details are going to become key, and I think this current generation of archaeology is going to be more focused on details and biographies rather than sort of macro pushing everything together.
To me, it's just really exciting that we can actually, the prospect that we're moving to the scale of events and so on. I think it's remarkable. I can't help but think of back when I was a student and how we were told that simply was not going to be possible. So it's great. There is a question here about concerning the Sea Peoples phenomenon. Carbon-14 dates do not exclude that major events happen in the first half of the 12th century BCE. Also, according to the 14C, would you agree with this or not, I guess?
The radiocarbon certainly does not exclude the possibility of the events linking together in the early part of the 12th century. But the interesting thing is, when that paper was originally published, it was possible to suggest that the radiocarbon and the Sea Peoples dates from standard analysis actually matched up. Now it would seem that as we get better analysis of the radiocarbon information, it's actually shifting the likely destructions at those two sites a little bit by a few decades later, which is interesting. Radiocarbon's always accused of pushing things earlier, but it's actually moving it a little bit later. And therefore we have to start to wonder, just because we know of the Sea Peoples in about that time, it's the classic mistake that Mike Bailey talked about, in which you sort of suck in and smear. That's not the only historical event that happened in the 12th century. Therefore, one has to question, if it's no longer a likely matchup, what else could perhaps be explaining those destructions? So it's not to deny it's possible, but it's wrong to think it's the only possibility.
Thank you. I guess the takeaway here, I'm just looking to see if there's any other comments or questions in the chat, but I think we probably have a chance for more discussion on this maybe later. But just, I guess, to emphasize that what I'm hearing is the critical importance of developing these local sequences or local histories, if you will, and then continuing to work collaboratively towards developing chronological sequences with them. And then we have the computational tools to help us begin to weave these together into the larger regional matrix that you're describing. Is that?
Yeah, so I mean, things like, for example, the stable isotope record I showed quickly and obviously hurried through lots of things, that is effectively a regional record. But the chronology for a site is very specific to that site, and the prior knowledge that allows you to get a highly resolved chronology comes from the detailed understanding of stratigraphy and the history of that site. So in order to get a big regional picture, you need to have all of those foundations in considerable detail. And it's only sites where that's fully understood does it work. And of course, it's interesting, where sometimes it doesn't work. The first thing that tends to happen is the excavator announce, oh, well, maybe we were made mistakes about some of our attributions of samples. Now, of course, if that's the case, it suggests the whole thing's built on foundations of sand. So we have to have high quality archaeology and high quality belief that when we make stratigraphic interpretations, that is a best effort, not just a case of it might be this. Then you do the analysis, you put those together, we can get a high resolution chronology and compare that to what we're getting from some of the climate proxies. Put together, that will give us the history, I think, and climate of the future.
We archaeologists never get our stratigraphy wrong, do we?
No, but I think that's one of the things which is being learned. Careful application of Bayesian chronological modeling is a test, effectively, for some of those assumptions. And if we see it that way, it's productive, which is occasionally to say we know X, Y, and Z, but we're not so sure about A and B. Well, you can set up a model that takes what we know, X, Y, and Z, and actually queries what could work for A, B, and C. So appropriate honesty is probably a critical thing here. And speaking as an excavator at the same time, one of those most important things I think one learns as a supervisor and director is to admit that you don't always know what's going on and actually start from the basis of, well, what can we work out rather than what do I know?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things that comes out of this for me is honesty and modesty as well, and recognizing our mistakes is probably a healthy thing to keep in mind here. There is one quick follow-up question to the Sea People's earlier one. Might the high Greek dates from Macedonia reflect such a phenomenon? And we'll let you give that as the last kind of kick at the can here, and then we'll call the session.
I think I could guess you might be asking a question like that. I will politely express a degree of skepticism about the high Greek dates from Macedonia. It's not that the radiocarbon measurements are probably not valid, it's what they're measuring. And of course, this is the all-critical thing. With modern AMS technology and assuming the samples have been properly pre-treated and so on, and any respectable radiocarbon lab are doing fairly similar methods these days, the date probably reflects the age of the sample. The question is the dated event the same as the target event? So working out what exactly you're dating is the key thing. So in the case of some of these North Greek sites, the exact relation between some of those contexts and what we believe and interpret to be the Greek sequence primarily defined from southern Greece is a question mark in some cases, and that needs more work and investigation.
Okay, thank you very much, Sturt. Excellent material. And with this, we'll end the first half of our session. We will reconvene, and I guess in the new window at about 16:30 CET time, just for everyone to know. Hopefully everyone will reconvene. We've got 3 more excellent papers to fill out the rest of the session starting in about half an hour. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. And I'm sure there will probably be further comments in the chat, but we'll leave you to that, Sturt. And
okay, thank you.
And thanks again. Okay.
Thank you.